Thank you, Michael, for those very kind words. It's great to be invited back by these, well, these two august bodies, the RES, which I know very well, and indeed the RSAA, which I think I gave my first lecture there 40 years ago. I think in 1978, and so in a sense, the wheel has come full circle. 78, if you remember, was the year of the great student uprisings in Paris and so on, and of course here about 68. Sorry, 78 was, and indeed, I know somebody who will know it very well. He was busy demonstrating in Grosvenor Square. But 78 was also the year of another incendiary book, as it seemed at the time. At that time, I was attached as an oral historian to the South Asian History Department at SOAS. And I remember the confusion when we were told, basically, the staff, Professor Ball, Hatchett, and on downwards, that we were not in a position to talk to any Indians about their history because we were Orientalists. And this was because of Edward Said's Orientalism, which came out in that year. And it had a devastating effect on studies, not so much because he wasn't entitled to say what he did, but the way it was taken totally, seriously, without any question. And since then, Robert Irwin and others have examined it carefully, and it is a very flawed book, but nevertheless it was a very important book. And now 40 years ago, history is repeating itself. I remember Professor Ball Hatchett getting extremely worried about what was happening about India's representation of its own history. And this is he actually published a paper, which was published in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, which was actually, I forget the title now, but it was something along the lines of, is Indian history losing its way? And of course you could say, well, he's part of the old school, and so am I, frankly, as many of you will know. Nevertheless, I want to look rigorously at how India looks at its history. And I'm not here to defend the British Raj, as you'll hear, but I am here to defend history, good history. Some of you may, I'm afraid, have seen my use of the Namboodiris before. These are my favorite little social group in India. If you go down to Kerala, all along the west coast, there was a group of ultra-Orthodox Brahmins who arrived there in about the 8th or 9th centuries, and they were the most authentic form of conservatism, Brahmanism. They were also the first to bring it south. And there were other Brahmins, but they were not what you might call Kacha Brahmins. They'd intermix with the local people and so on. Whereas these guys said, no, we're in a class of our own, and they imposed their Vedas on the local people. And they did this by joining forces with the local warrior community, the Nayars or Nairs. And this was extremely successful interdependence, which ultimately meant that they became tyrants. By the time Travancore state came into being in 1729, the Namboodiris had become the most powerful landowners in the land. They were running some of the richest temples in India, indeed the richest temple. I don't know if you've been reading about the scandals of all the treasure that's being unearthed from Tiruvallava. I'm sorry, that's not Tiruvallava, I've got it wrong. Somebody will correct me from South India. Sorry, Tiruvallava is that famous writer. Thank you very much. But they also brought into law a quite astonishing series of restrictive measures, all of them based on the idea of caste pollution. There were fixed distances set down between a Brahmin and everybody else. For instance, a Nair had to keep 6 paces, and so it went on in numbers of 6 until it got to 72 paces if you were a pariah. You all know that word. In other words, the ultimate lower caste. Outcast, avarna, those without caste. Nair men, for example, could wear moustaches, but not their inferiors. Their women could wear silver but not gold, because that was for the Brahmins, and the rest none at all. Nor could the underclass carry parasols or wear footwear, nor could their children go to school. They couldn't drink from the public wells. They couldn't wear new clothes without first soiling them, which is a disgusting thing. They couldn't put up walls or gates, and they couldn't put tiles on their roofs. And if they had to converse with a Brahmin, they had to observe the correct distance, and they had to cover their mouths, they had to remain bowed, and they had to speak of themselves in the first person. Now, you could say that might not have mattered, except this was then applied as a means of taxation. In other words, you could get out of these things if you paid tax. And by the start of the 19th century, the ordinary people of Travancore were being required to pay as many as 100 petty taxes, ranging from, I'll just read you a few: head tax, hut tax, marriage tax, taxes on the tools of one's trade, family cow, the goat, the dog, jewellery, festivals, moustaches, and above all, that awful thing called mulakaram, the breast tax. In other words, the lower castes had to could not cover their breasts unless they paid tax. And of course, this is deeply resented, particularly in an area where there were Muslims and indeed where there were Christians. And the Brahmins naturally paid no tax at all. Well, we don't read about that now. Well, no, not at all, because in 1810, the British East India Company moved in. And they appointed, I'm sorry to say, this is a very distant ancestor of mine, so I'm going to blow his trumpet a wee bit, but of course I'm biased. Major John Munro, whose uncle was a more famous Munro. He became resident of Travancore in 1810, and he very quickly concluded that Travancore was rotten from top to bottom. No description, he wrote, can produce an adequate impression of the tyranny, the corruption, the abuses of the system, full of activity and energy and everything mischievous, oppressive and infamous, but slow and dilatory to effect any purpose of humanity, mercy, justice. On the part of the people, complaint is useless, redress hopeless. They have only one remedy, and that is bribery. And in those melancholy circumstances, I'm still quoting, to interfere would be a great evil, but necessarily resorted to as a good, to mitigate the still more intolerable grievances of injustice and oppression. In other words, he's going to do something he disapproves of, but he thinks it's in the interests of justice. And on Munro's advice, the 19-year-old Queen, let's move on. This was a pretty strange picture of John Munro, but at the time it was the best I could find. I think it's from a miniature which somebody's tried to draw. There is old John Munro, and there is that wonderful lady, the Queen Regent. She's 19-year-old, and she is Lakshmi Bai, Rani Lakshmi Bai. On his advice, she dismissed the Diwan, the chief minister. And in 1811, she asked for permission to allow Munro to take his place. So uniquely, in 1811, Munro becomes resident and Diwan. And that's unique as far as I can see in India. He had, of course, dictatorial powers. What did he do with it? Well, the records show that Munro instituted extensive reforms. He halved the number of taxes. He tripled the revenue. He placed more than 15,000 temples under state management, which is much resented, of course, by the Nambudris. He introduced a police network, police stations, police chiefs, set up a modern judicial system, Central Court of Appeal, local courts presided over by 3 judges, not just one. And we have also to give him credit for the Royal Proclamation of 1812 that abolished the buying and selling of slaves, because slavery was very much a big deal in India at that time. And for good measure, in 1815, he gave the lower caste tenant farmers greater rights. He also lobbied for the first Christian missions to be allowed in, which is, on the one hand, a source of great resentment. On the other hand, it actually made Travancore what it was today. In other words, the most advanced state in India. Let's have a look at dear old John Munro. I put this in really because it's a rather historic photograph. As you can see who took it. It's actually a very early photograph. And here is the old fellow in retirement in his family home in Scotland. So what had happened? Well, by the time of his retirement, 5 years later, 1819, the Kingdom of Travancore had become, and I quote here, please remember this is a quote, the first in the world to decree universal, compulsory and free education for both boys and girls. Now that quote comes from a book called Inglorious Empire, and it's essentially saying, look, this is how well an Indian native state could do without interference from the John Company. And of course it shows how ignorant the author is, because he got it absolutely wrong. He got it utterly the wrong way round. Without that intervention, it would have been a tyrannical state for much longer. And this is by a man who is Kerala born and a Kerala MP. Now, I'm afraid I'm going to throw the book at this particular author in a minute. Of course, the question is, who then is the greater tyrant? Is it John Company or is it the Brahmin? Well, there's no point. There's no point in even asking the question. But my point is this: imperialism comes in many different forms. What is it? Well, essentially, it's the domination of a weaker culture by a stronger culture. I mean, that basically is imperialism. And it's always going to be exploitative. So no bones about that. It's always going to be an exploitative process. It cannot be otherwise, because whether it's Rome or Greece, whatever it is. However, how do we judge it? This is the point. How do we look at it historically? And that's really compared, and I think the key really is compared to what? I had the advice of three marvelous historians. First of all, John Kay, who many of you I think will know, dear old John, but also an eminent economic historian. And I'm afraid I'm going to bore you silly with economics in a minute, because it's crucial. Unless we have the statistics, then there's no point in challenging various claims. And the statistics are there. And to my shame, Zaria Masani has also played a part in this. Some of you will know him. He wrote an excellent biography, quite critical of Lord Macaulay. But the key man for me here, been enormous help, is Professor Tirthankar Roy at the LSE. He's India's leading economic historian of the day. And so I promise you, we have looked into this very carefully, because this issue has been so irritating for a lot of historians that we are determined to kind of strike back. Where are we? Now, John Kay. Well, he said, the conduct of states as of individuals can only be assessed by the standards of their age. Now, that statement has been dismissed as amusing but indefensible. Who said it? The author of this book. It's not indefensible at all. It can be very well defended. And that idea, that any idea of parallels or putting comparisons or putting things in context, the idea that it should be dismissed as amusing but indefensible shows to me what is so horribly wrong, what's going so horribly wrong with Indian history at the moment. And this is after years of traveling in India, and I've met so many good people there, and it distresses me terribly, because I think it's quite dangerous what's been happening. Some of you will know Dr. Eric Hobsbawm, or know of him. He was a great Marxist historian, and he's come up with a very good quote that I know some years, which I've used frequently. The raw material of nationalist or ethnic or fundamentalist ideology, that is what history is about. I mean, that's what history draws on. But you have a duty, if you're a historian, you have a duty to criticize the political, ideological abuse of history. And that essentially is what I'm going to talk about tonight, because essentially what Shashi, and I'll talk about Shashi Tharoor in a minute, what he's doing here is essentially he exemplifies essentially the Congress Party's concept of history. What is it? It's a once rich nation reduced to poverty by British imperialism, by British rapacity. And that is the so-called drain theory. I think I've forgotten to show some images. Yes, here's old dear old Shashi. This is the, I think I may have got the order wrong, but it doesn't matter. We'll come back to it. This is the so-called drain theory. Well, I'll move on. I want to talk about the drain theory, because I think there we go. Here's a lovely wise old man. I think we have a descendant in the audience. This is that nationalist politician, Dadabhai Naoroji. He was the first Indian member of parliament in Britain. I'm sure some of you might remember that. But he did write a book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, a very polite book, published in 1901. And he argued for the first time that India had been hugely rich before the British drained it of its wealth. And then that idea was picked up by R.C. Dutt, a very distinguished economic historian, who wrote the economic history of India under British rule. And generations of nationalists have essentially followed that same line, its most influential proponent of our day being Shashi Tharoor. Now, I think we do need to talk a little bit about this man. He's a lovely guy, can I say that first of all? He's the most charming, clever, witty politician that I've ever met, but he is a politician. He's a former diplomat. Apologist to all ex-diplomats here. He is a senior member of the Congress Party, and he's a long-serving member of Parliament for Kerala, as I mentioned earlier. a man of extraordinary intellect, I have to say, extreme personal charm, and in the eyes of many, he's a future leader of the Congress Party. And I think this is what we're getting at here. Is this a bid? This is essentially what worries me terribly. He sees himself as a future leader of the Congress Party, and I think he will be, but perhaps he has higher ambitions. He certainly won't achieve them while Mr. Modi is around. And he's also one of the finest orators of our age. And I do ask you, if you've not seen YouTube, it's been viewed by more than 5 million people, mostly young people in India. And this was his debate in the Oxford Union when he argued for Britain should reparations, essentially, the argument of reparations. Now, there's nothing new about India, about history as national mythology. We all indulge in it. And from James Mill and somebody like James Mill onwards, James Mill, Thomas Macaulay, this is, of course, Macaulay in his notorious Minute on Education, they presented their country's role in India as a mission to civilize Oriental despotism and barbarism. So Thomas Macaulay's famously, of course, has rubbished Indian culture and made the case for British rule. And that same case, curiously enough, was made almost 50 years later, 100 years later, by Catherine Mayo. Now, who remembers this book today? But it caused an enormous outrage throughout India when it came out in the 1920s. I think 1927, yeah. And particularly the nationalists were up in arms, most particularly by Mahatma Gandhi. Now, what was it? Now, Catherine Mayo rather spoiled the case by being a white supremacist, an American white supremacist, which is not a good start. But she basically argued that Indians were unfit to rule because, chiefly on account of their treatment of women, their treatment of the lower castes, and their treatment of children, widow remarriage, and so on. Ironically, I'm astonished to find that it's now going a lot of reassessment in India. And in particular, I would urge you to read this particular book, which I found astonishing. Mrinalini Sen, I don't know if anyone's for Sinha, sorry. She's brought out an edited version of it, and she argues that actually she was saying a lot of sensible things that particularly Indian women need to take on board, and indeed politicians need to take on board. And actually one of the most influences, she had a great influence on Gandhi, because up to that point, Gandhi had been, he argued vociferously against this book and said it was a scandal and it belonged in the gutter. But actually, he then stopped talking about the beauty of the caste system. He had been talking about the beauty of the caste system up to this point, and then he rather shut up at that point. Now, that sounds, I mean, also, that wonderful man, Dr. Ambedkar, also had something to do with it. But certainly, Gandhi was forced to amend his views that we would now call racist, I think. Now, what happens in 1947? Well, what is fascinating is you get a reversal of what you might call the Macaulayite position. So the Congress Party sets about nation building with a very laudable aim of creating national unity, and in their promotion of what we must call the foundation myth of the freedom struggle, I don't mean it's not a myth, but the idea that this was the key element, just as in America, in the War of Independence, so important. Here again, the freedom struggle becomes hugely important. But it's necessary to present what has gone before as a period of unmitigated colonial oppression, and the Indian peoples, not just as victims, but as having been united against that oppression. And what's horrific is to read, I don't know if you know, there's a body in India called India's National Council for Educational Research and Training. Basically, it sets the curriculum. And in 1982, it came out with a series of diktats requiring schools to gloss over such sensitive areas as sectarian conflict. I quote you, "Characterization of the medieval period as a dark period or as a time of conflict between Hindus and Muslims is forbidden." That horrible word, forbidden, haram, you might say. And the tragedy is what happens when you get this kind of closing, this sanitization, this simplistic view of the past. Well, virtually everybody in India post-1978, I would say, has more or less taken this on board. Having said that, this book makes a devastating case for the prosecution. It's not history, but it is a devastating case. And it was interesting that my old friend sorry, Tirthankar Roy actually did an interview, did a review of it, and he tore it to pieces and said, you know, he said, it makes much of blood-curdling and colourful language. Even so, very polite man he is, Dr. Roy. However, none of these qualities make the interpretation right. So there we go. So let's move on a bit. Where have we got to? Yes. So Inglorious Empire draws not only on Dadabhai Naoroji, but also on two Americans who had a huge influence on shaping America's view of India and indeed the British in India. And the first of those was a missionary, I've forgotten, I'm so sorry, Jabez Sunderland, there he is on the right, who brought out a book really in response to Catherine Mayo's book. It came out the next year and was a kind of argument back. India in Bondage, he wrote, and then later on we get, more famously, Will Durant in his monumental History of Civilization, volume 7 of which present India as a once flourishing civilization brought low by Britain's economic plundering. In other words, the drain theory. Now, I'm going to bore you silly with some economics now, because unless we face this, really, we're not going to get anywhere with how badly wrong things have gone. Now, the most damning and the most frequently quoted statement from Shashi's book here speeches on the drain theory, and it's on the covers of the book usually, not this one, but certainly in India. And it says, at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of the world economy was 23%, as large as all Europe put together. By the time the British department, India had dropped to just 3%. Sometimes it was 4%. Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. And this summarizes the drain theory, essentially. And it is quoted frequently now, I've noticed. And if we... I'm now going to look... Sorry about this, but take this on board. If you look at the top three colours, in other words, India, China, and Western Europe, and if you look down and you look at 1700, you will see that in about 1700, according to these statistics, they're all about the same, about a third each? No, about 23% each. And if you carry on India's line, you will see that it then goes into dramatic free fall. And it really only emerges from that after 1973. And now, of course, India, of course, as we all know, is overtaking the GDP. So here we are, share of the world's GDP. So this is known as the Great Divergence among economists. So how do we account for it? How do we account for this extraordinary reversal of fortunes, if not as a consequence of the drain theory and Shashi Tharoor's depredations? Well, this actually comes from the late British economist Angus Maddison. Very important historian, is a real pioneer in terms of world economics as opposed to local economics. And he did his best on minimal statistics to produce this really very well-known chart. From Contours of the World Economy, I think it's 2004. It may have been earlier. I'm so sorry. I should have. Where are we? 2007. Yeah, 2007. But the problem is, it's been totally overtaken by much more accurate statistics. So sorry. Yeah. I mean, I won't quote, but I'm going to go on to the next figure. If you'll forgive this rather crude one, I've just knocked it up myself. This is the work of, you'll see below, three academics here, Broadbury, Custodiet, and Gupta, India and the Great Divergence. And this is much more subtle because it looks both at national GDP but also per capita income. And they argue that this actually is the key event. I'm going to read this if I may. And indeed, Tirthankar Roy, who I've quoted earlier, he's actually published, even more recently, a book which totally explodes the drain theory. And he's showing that the share of India's national income creamed off by the British elite was far too small to match India's economic either way. The nationalist argument that India had to pay through the nose for Britain's military and civilian services and to cover capital investments is simply not borne out by the statistics. And they actually show that India would have spent just as much if it had provided its own services. In other words, when the army goes out, who's going to pay for the British army, Indian army? Well, Indians are going to pay for it, in the sense that this is deeply resented among nationalists because, this is an alien army. You can argue it's because it was a very integral army, but it was no different from a Mughal army, you could say, but nevertheless, it's taken as an alien army. So, yes, of course, British tariffs, that the British imposed tariffs and so on. These did certainly play a part, but nothing to the degree. I'm not going to quote too much because I'm very conscious that time is pressing. But I am going to quote you these other findings because I think they do show. Even so, modern research shows that in changing the Mughal land revenue system, the British administration in India did not, as Thoreau and others claim, bleed the farmers dry. Land tax actually decreased to the extent that by 1900, it amounted to no more than 5% of agricultural output. And most crucially of all, Thoreau's central argument that Britain de-industrialized India and reduced it from an exporter of textiles into an exporter of raw cotton simply does not stand up. It was British technology, not rapacity, that did for India's weavers. And this has been shown as long as 1996. In Economy of Modern India by Professor Tomlinson. So there's an awful lot of evidence among economists as opposed to politician historians that in fact this is all nonsense. I'm just going to remind you, forgive me because it's astonishing how much we forget or don't know about our own history. India, yes, of course, for centuries it had been the preeminent exporter of textiles, right from the days of the Greeks and the Romans. But a number of hugely important developments took place in the 18th century. I think of the Huguenot weavers, the refugees, 50,000 of them come and they settle in Spitalfields and they modernize the silk weaving industry. And they move north. And so what happens in 1721? You get the first, it's a water-driven mill, first mechanized factory in Derby. You can see it on the left there, where one worker now does twice as much as 50 had done before. So mechanization is coming in, but crucially, still at this time, India's low wages mean that it's still uneconomic for Britain to export to India. But things changed. 1772, you'll know this lovely picture by Joseph Wright of Cromford Mill, taken by moonlight. Here they are, look, the lights are blazing through the middle of the night because they're working in shifts round the clock. 200 people, including children, working round the clock. And of course, this is followed by other developments. But more importantly, things like capital is available, because we get a system here of capital being available to invest. Within 20 years, what's happening of 1782, we are now exporting textiles to India, and they will never catch up again until modern times. So India basically is stagnating. Technology and productivity have simply not moved forward. They're stuck in the Middle Ages. Why? Now, this is a cruel thing to say, in a sense. It is preposterous, says Shashi, to suggest that India's inability to industrialize while the Western world did so was an Indian failure, the result of some sort of native deficiency. But alas, plenty of economic historians have argued just that it was Indian society that was at fault rather than the British. And this is something that we have to, I'm not going to say any more here because I know we've got a couple of journalists here, and so I'm not going to say any more about Hindu fantasies. But nevertheless, good history demands context. And alas, this is something that Thoreau ignores. Let's look at Indian society, and I suppose this is the crux of my session here tonight. Shashi says that Aurangzeb, fantastic, 10 times richer Mughal India than anywhere else in the world. It's simply not true. The last 25 years of his rule were catastrophic. He oversimplified the administration. He reduced his ministers to ciphers. He abandoned religious tolerance, famously, because of the fatwa. He wanted Muslim fatwa. And of course, that came with all sorts of... In other words, he abandoned the policy of his father and grandfather, Akbar and Shah Jahan and Jahangir and so on. not so much Shah Jahan, but certainly Jahangir and Akbar. So what happens in that, if the Mughal Empire is fatally weakened by Aurangzeb, he's going on these interminable wars against the Deccan, huge military expenditure. He's also doing dreadful things like replacing the existing Rayatwari system, and he bankrupts the state. His death, as you know, leads on to interminable power struggles, not only among his descendants, but it allows the local governors then to establish themselves as local rulers. And of course, we talk about, you can see what I've listed there. And it's not just the Marathas, the Sikhs, or Awadh, Bengal, etc. It's also the East India Company. And let's remember this curious, we'll go on one more thing. I'm mystified, but I do know the political reasons for doing so. Why Shashi Tharoor is so nice about the Marathas or the Maharashtrians. Anyone who lives in Bombay will know what a powerful lobby they are. And Shashi Tharoor says, it would have been wonderful if the Marathas had taken over. Now, if you know your Indian history, I think there are a lot of people who say no, not a bit of it. Unpopular though it may be to say so today, all the local records show that the Marathas' predations on their neighbours were anything but benign. I'm going to quote one example, which is the Maratha devastation of Bengal. Who knows about it outside Bengal? Nobody does. In 1840, they began a series of raids that went on for a decade. And in the process, now, Bengal had been the preeminent centre of textile manufacture. It was destroyed. But more than that, what happened? Refugees came to a growing city nearby, Calcutta. The bankers fled from the Marathas and came to Calcutta. So what happens in Calcutta? Well, the East India Company take advantage of this wonderful manpower and this capital. And that, of course, transforms Plassey. Yes, of course, he's a horrible man, corrupt, etc. This is the age of the Nabob and all those things that we read about. But it's quite a brief period, if you think about it. Let's say 1865, I think the Firman is granted 63. And, of course, by the time 1883, Parliament has stepped in and people like Warren Hastings have come out to try and improve morality. Sorry? Sorry, did I 18? I'm so sorry, yes. 17, sorry. Yeah, 17th century, sorry. 18th century, sorry, yeah. Oh, quickly, I've got to wind up now. So sorry, Cromford Mill, Brahmins, yes, so we really do need to look at this issue. Why the stagnation? And again, this is a sensitive subject, and I know for my Indian friends it's hard to kind of accept this. Let's look at one example here. Look at the old-fashioned Madras presidency. Look at the date, 1860. So look at the Parsis. Now, you'll know the history of the Parsis. I'm sure many of you do. We have a lovely picture of I think there he is. I think that's, it's not Jamshedji Niziwadji. It's Lauji Wadia. He's invited, isn't it? Sorry, that's Jijiboy. I'm sorry. Anyway, as you know, the history is that the what you might call the founder of the house, Wadia, is invited down from Surat to Bombay. He brings 10 carpenters, and I missed out a lovely picture. Okay, I haven't got it there. Yes, I have. What's this about? Yes, it's the first spinning mill. So you can see, have I got a date there? 1856. 1856. So, 1772 in Britain, and here's the first one in India. Why? And the answer is the Parsis. Why the Parsis? Because they weren't inhibited by caste and custom. They were free to do, they were open-minded, they were very keen on education. As you know, they even, I was astonished to find how much of their correspondence is done in English. Now, you may say that's a very bad thing. In other words, it had a huge impact. And I'm sure you know the story. Here he is, Lauji, I think. And you will know that in 1844, the flagship at the Battle of Navarino was HMS Asia. If you go up to West Hartlepool, you'll see the oldest ship afloat in the world, HMS Trincomalee, a frigate, 1815. And of course, you know the history of them. Not only, I think they owned half of Bombay by 1815. And not only that, but of course they were enormous, as well as being entrepreneurs. Yes, of course they made their money from opium and things that we would now regard as thoroughly disreputable. They were very big in trade. They had their own ships, etc., etc. They freewheeled and they made an awful lot of money, and they piled a lot of that money back into Bombay, which really owes a massive debt to the Parsis. And it's very sad to find how often they are attacked. There's a dear old man who I remember I made the mistake of taking him too seriously when he said, "Don't pull any punches for J.R.D. Tata." And I didn't pull any punches, and so they never published the book, because poor old J.R.D. had died by then. He's a lovely, lovely man. So we must move on. Sorry, I'm trying to wind up now. I really am. Yes, I think this is the key. Painful. Why, if the Parsis could be so successful then, and if Indian industrialists can be so hugely successful today, it's not just the Tatas, of course, it's all the other entrepreneurs who've done so well. Why? What stopped India from modernizing? And I think we've got to look at caste. We've got to look at Hindu society. And not only the Hindu side, but also the Mughal side. Now, I've described the Brahmins elsewhere as the oldest closed shop in history. And I think that's fair, because here there's extraordinary thinkers, philosophers, and priests who came into India about 1500 BC, and who brought with them this immensely strong culture based on these two words, the Vedas, the knowledge, but also that other word, of course, Varna. And you can translate Varna in sorts of ways. The Portuguese use the word casta, caste, which I dislike intensely, but basically the idea of some people being superior to others. Let's always remember that. And in fact, some translations of Varna is color. And so we get possibly these paler-skinned people coming down into India and imposing their values on the local population. The Desus, the Dasus, who are always considered to be troublemakers or slaves or servants, and this is 90% of the rest of the population. So Brahmin culture as developed is essentially hermetic. I do want to make this point. And now Gandhi famously says, and he's quite right, if Hindu society has been able to stand, it is because it was founded on the caste system. Yes, it's true. But let's think about what happens. Caste-based hereditary occupations restricted social mobility. Caste taboos inhibited egalitarianism, leading to reduced working capacity, low life expectancy. Caste-restricted education was religious rather than secular. Limiting the acquisition of new knowledge and technology. Caste taboos against swimming, for heaven's sake. You couldn't go you had to keep 1 foot on the ground if you went into the sea. And of course, this is because these are people who've come from Central Asia. They've never seen an ocean. Therefore, it is, to use a Muslim word, haram. It is basically, against, it is a polluting element. And therefore, now what would India have been if it had had a navy? So who were the sailors? Who were the fishermen? The pariahs, for heaven's sake. Only the pariahs had an occupation of going to sea and so on. So who took advantage of it? Well, where do we start? The Yemenis, the Romans, the Greeks, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch, and the British. We were able to exploit the seas and therefore export. I've left out the Chinese. And India had a huge disadvantage because of that. I'm rather proud of that fact, because I haven't seen anybody else make anything of it. So yes, of course they're always right to castigate the British because of its own particular form of apartheid. It was very nasty. You remember that passage in Nehru writes about, I'm a man of my own country and I'm not allowed to enter certain railway carriages. It's in I think it's Letter to His Daughter, or Discovery of India, I think. I mean, it is deeply humiliating, and that's to be separated from the other things. So sorry, where have we got to? Now, does Shashi talk about Varna and the caste? Not a single reference. And I actually challenged him at one point. And I said, Shashi, you haven't said a word about caste. And he said, oh no, that's an invention of the British. And alas, and that would be almost funny if it wasn't for the fact that this is now, I'm so sorry, I've lost my page 11. Page 11. So sorry, I'm nearly finishing, I promise you now, here we are. Yes, his answer was that the British invented caste. Now that has now become a central pillar of the Hindutva philosophy. And it goes along with other things. For example, the belief that Orientalists, the great Orientalists, as you know, I'm a passionate advocate of Orientalism in India, that the great Orientalists translated the great Sanskrit texts and the great, all the other texts that had been lying there unspread, in the sense that they were restricted to a tiny, tiny elite. But in doing so, why do they do so? I'm going to quote. As part of a strategy by the East India Company to penetrate the Hindu psyche, thereby facilitating the divide and rule policy more effectively. Now that is such an insult when you look at people like Sir William Jones. And my thesis is that actually it's this element, it's the one saving grace. I haven't been critical about the British, but I am very critical about the British. I think there are all sorts of nasty elements. But for me, the one saving grace is Orientalism because of its impact. It wasn't that they simply discovered, as you know, I've written about rediscovering India's history and the translations, is the fact that they made it accessible. And the fact that they got together with local Brahmins and others and actually started to influence them. And that brings about a huge change, particularly, of course, in Bengal. You know about the Bengal Renaissance. And I'm so pleased to see that there are a couple of Indian historians, Deshpande is one, who have actually said, this is the single biggest influence on the Bengal Renaissance was the fact that the British had these colleges and so on, where we exchanged ideas. So I would argue that's far bigger, far more important trope than the English language and laws and railways and all the whole familiar "what did the Romans ever do for us" trope. You know the one I mean. That Orientalism actually is it. What does it do? And that wonderful word Aufklärung, I don't know if you know, but Kant comes up with it, and he defines Aufklärung, which can be translated as, I suppose, enlightenment. There I've got to stop. I'm going to go on for 2 minutes to wind up. Sorry about that, but I know I would overrun otherwise. Aufklärung has an almost exact equivalent in the Indian Prakrit, Buddha, meaning awakening, and it's something that you know about. It's the awakening of the great moral philosophers of the 5th century in Magadha. I'm talking about people like Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, Sakyamuni, the founder of Buddhism, Gosala, the founder of Ajivikism, in which a group of city people, city dwellers essentially, I think, got together and began to exchange ideas and challenge orthodoxy. And that essentially is what the Orientalists are doing. They are challenging orthodoxy. And as you know, all these religions were at one time or another, these heterodox religions, particularly Buddhism, were really zapped by orthodoxy, by Brahminical Hinduism. My hero, of course, I hardly need to mention him to you. My great hero, William Jones, who actually stays on in India after his 10 years in order to translate the Hindu codes of Manu, and actually dies there of a liver complaint. And of course, most particularly, but it's not just the Asiatic Society of Bengal. It's also the other thing, the exchange of ideas between teachers and pupils as they learn their language. Now, so as I say, I've championed this. So I believe that this Orientalism actually led to an enormous liberation. And it's interesting that some of the earliest people who went over, you might say, as collaborators, were Brahmins. There were Brahmins who realized that it was in their interests to actually work as local diwans in various places, to join the administration, and indeed to offer their skills. And it's no surprise for me to find that, particularly in South India, that I think 6 of the Nobel Prize winners in mathematics are Tamil Brahmins. I think it's 3, and of course we've got a famous one here, Amartya Sen. Although I think some people would say he's not a Brahmin. I'm sorry, does anybody know? I'm not quite sure. No, to finish off, here we go. Yes, I really am finishing off now. Yes. Earlier on, I referred to the Nambuthiris, and I did so very disparagingly, but they were wonderful thinkers. And thanks to a guy called Charles Wish, who's a local political agent, we know that Charles Wish stumbled on some papers which showed that Nambuthiris had actually been writing down, let me get the phrase, I'm not good on mathematics, logarithms, 2.5 centuries before the Western world discovered this. So here they are, but what happened? They didn't. They kept it to themselves. And it isn't until Wish comes along and finds these manuscripts, and you'll find them upstairs in the archives here. Because Charles Wish dies, unfortunately, just before his paper can be published. But here, if you read it, you'll have time to read it, I haven't, you'll see that actually, this was an invention. But does it matter? If nobody knows about it, what's the importance of that invention? It's only by communicating it to others and making it available. Now, of course, the British are particularly lucky. They've got the printing press. But boy, do they make use of it. And so this knowledge spreads. And I think that, again, is hugely important for Orientalism. All right, I think I'm more or less finished about it now. Here we go. Yes, over the course of 2.5 centuries, nearly 2 centuries, India was much sinned against by the British imperialism. But it also did much damage to itself. It impeded its modernization. History is never black and white. I believe that we owe it to enlightened Indians, enlightened Britons, the best of the Brits, basically, those who came out there and were really interested in Indian culture, that we shouldn't actually traduce their memories in books like this. It's a great read, but it's bad history. That's what it boils down to. It's symptomatic, as I say, of a dangerous trend in Indian politics today, which is, as some of you will know, it's rapidly polarizing. I mean, I think it's happening, it's a universal phenomenon. We could argue it's happening here too. There's a polarization between the secularists, perhaps the Marxists, you might say, on the one hand, and on the other hand, those who are driven by religious ideology, particularly the Hindutva movement, and indeed conservative Islam too. I would call them xenophobic religious nationalists. I began with a warning by Eric Hobsbawm, a British historian. I'm going to end with my, I know I'm going to upset my good friend over there, Romila Thapa. She's been my heroine for years. She's now in her late 80s. She's still educating. JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University outside Delhi, is really a kind of fountainhead of enlightenment and modern ideas, and they're really being battered from all sides by the Hindutvas. We really have got to stand up and defend them. This is what she said. Oh, she said this as long ago, I think in 1978. Remember, she said, when you read a book, to be very cynical. All historians, when they put out theories, have an axe to grind and have a political message. So always ask yourself, what is the political message of this historian that you might be reading? And that is my last word on this. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm sure we'll have 1 or 2 critics.
Thank you very much. I see hands going up already. So let me take 1, 2, and I'll pick my 3. And I'll pick
if you don't mind, may I sit down?
Gentleman in the middle. Okay.
Do you mind if I sit down? I'm not as young as I was.
So it seems that you attacked the notion that history is all kind of good and bad, black and white, victims and perpetrators, but then proceeded to... No, I know, but I would agree with that point, but I think you then lapsed into basically arguing within that framework. And that perhaps...
What particular point?
Well, simply that it seems to be what you were doing is defending the British record, which I think there is a good argument to be made for in some cases, but I think what it tends towards is the modern way people tend to view history, which I studied history. The thing that annoys me the most is that it tends to be treated as the world today and historically has always been a small number of perpetrators, a large number of victims, and it's almost preordained which one you're going to be in, and everything about you and everything about the world today is governed by those facts. Yeah. And that before, the age of kind of Western expansionism, if you like, it's almost a paradise lost myth. It's almost you had an unsullied Garden of Eden until the Western Satan arrived and poisoned everything for everybody. And it seems to me that though you were countering this...
Who is saying that?
I think that is the prevailing message that people are taught at schools and universities today.
Oh, is it here?
Certainly my experience, yeah. I think you did a very good job of standing up against it, but I think you also have to be careful not to fall into that framework.
I think that's a very fair point. I don't know if you know that there was a famous YouTube, questionnaire which showed that 43% of Brits think that the British Empire was a jolly good thing, and only 22 think that it was a bad thing. And I think that is the prevailing attitude, and it's one that I thoroughly disapprove of. I have to say.
I think
We can talk about individuals. I can talk about my father. I can talk about some of the people I suspect in this room. No, they're not old enough. Certainly people like my father, who were, I think, thoroughly good eggs, like indeed John Munro was, because that isn't what imperialism is about.
No, but I agree with you.
I'm sorry,
Okay,
just ask you one question, I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah. And I think the other thing is, I was mainly concerned with demolishing the grain period.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can argue that particular British thing. It's just simply bad economics.
Gentleman over here. Might I ask, is there any evidence to suggest the British Raj was aware of these problems within the society in India? And did they actually do anything, or what did they do, actually to improve the situation and ensure that these modernized developments were made available, were encouraged within the Indian society itself?
I think that's probably as important a question as I see it this evening. I think it is one of the shameful aspects in the sense it's all about building railways and so on, but as you know, all the investment for the railways came from Europe, and they were the ones who benefited, the shareholders and so on. On the other hand, you could say, well, was there no local capital they could have put into the railways? There are some, and I think Baroda, actually funded its own railways in other places. There are, as you know, model states like Baroda. I'm a great fan of Baroda, but I've forgotten your question. My brain is going. I apologise for the laugh there. Sorry. I didn't answer your question.
No, but it was really just to suggest that were the British perhaps derelict in not actually developing and modernising the society which was there?
I think, and I know that some of you who are much more eminent historians than I am would argue that one of the things that the Brits were very, very concerned about was not upsetting local custom. And I think this is a very awkward business. You will know that in 1857 you can talk about it being a war of independence, but what were the rebels, by which I mean the Indian soldiery, initially? What were they actually shouting? And the word is they were not concerned, their word was deen, both sides. In other words, faith. They were actually concerned about the improvements, as people like Lord Bentinck and others. Do I mean Lord Bentinck? Yes, I do. Yeah, we're actually bringing in terms of widow, a widow remarriage, sati, etc., etc. Now you can say they're very superficial, but they were very superficial. And nevertheless, I think there was a great feeling after 1857 that we're not going to get into this area. We're not actually going to try and change local people. I mean, you could argue education, but it was slow. But then, compared with what? Look at education in this country too. Look at child labour in this country. Governments tend to be exploitative. Well, they take advantage of. You've seen this terrible, shocking thing that's been happening lately. Who could have imagined that a government, modern day government, would treat, its well-established British subjects, as well, you know the story, and then you could say more. Is that fair point? It's not.
I'm not sure it's fair. Well, it's fair to take you away from the economic subject, which I'm fascinated by, because it does put it all.
Well, I'm sorry at such length, but it's so important to me, it seems to me.
One of the criticisms of the British is up to 1820, the British soldiers and officials tended to have a fairly relaxed view on terms of relations with the Indian peoples, Muslim or Hindu or whatever. I mean, like Skinner, for example, on that dynasty. And then from about 1820 onwards, or perhaps later, the European wife came out. And that allegedly put a kibosh on it. And you had the development of the Calabar, you have the attempt to ensure that Indians were tried in their own court, was the name of that legislation.
Well, the other way around.
The Ilbert legislation, which was overthrown by the lobbying of the colonists, the so-called colonists in India.
Yeah.
So, I wonder if you could say something about that, which is away from your economic side.
No, I quite agree. I can think of all sorts of colonial officials. I think is it Blunt is a famous example. A lot of critics, and indeed Wedderburn and all the others. Think Wedderburn. He lost his family in the Crusade mission, and there he was, the first person to say, look, we've got to set up, we've got to allow the Indians to have their own mechanism, and he becomes a key member of the Indian National Congress. Hume again, people forget that Hume was actually one of the guys responsible for the salt tax. But of course he very quickly changes his mind and says, this is not fair, we've got to give India. And I would, when you look at one or two examples, I don't like blaming the Mamsab, that seems to be the thing. I would blame people like Charles Trevelyan. Now, Charles Trevelyan comes out and he's an absolute prick. And what does he do? Well, he tries to bring a case for corruption against his AGG. You know, in Delhi, he actually accuses him of corruption. And it's only by doggedness that he actually gets the man sacked. I mean, the guy was just minting. This is, I think, Delhi in about 1820. But then what does he do? He becomes an evangelical. And he says, you know, we've got to, these are degraded people. We've got to bring them the blessings of Christianity, etc., etc. And of course, he actually, it's not poor old Macaulay who gets the blame for the militant education. I mean, they're dictated to him by Charles Trevelyan.
Because well, that's but I really need to write a reply to a lady here. I think given
On the same point, I would absolutely agree with you. It wasn't the women. It was the puritanical attitude of particularly the Wellington, the brothers.
The three of them.
My forebears were the Gardner family, who, like the Skinners, had a regimental horse. And they always said he intermarried very happily with our local, probably our local royalty, and they eventually married the children of the last mover emperor, so they were Hindu and Muslim. Nobody worried at all. The Gardner women all lived in as inner quarters and lived as Indians. But then along came the puritanical army people mainly, and that then.
And sadly, you know, they went down there very fast because of the prejudices, you know.
Yes.
I'm sorry to say that I think my great-grandfather had something to do with that. In as much as he famously, either he or Rudyard Kipling, wrote that, you know, the half-caste were attended, and it was Gardner, attended an international congress, what Canberra was. And Gardner tried to horsewhip either Kipling or my great-grandfather. I think Kipling was quite quickly left the country after that. And of course, no, I can't. I think you're absolutely right. I don't think there's much we can say about that.
I was surprised how excited you are and concerned you are about this whole business. I mean, fashions go up and down. In my time, of course, maybe the young people tried to be sort of, you know, revolutionary, but the older people said, well, of course, we had the good, there were the good and the bad things. I mean, the whole legal systems in India and Pakistan are very much British systems, and then people go to barristers in British courts. They wouldn't have preserved their monuments without the British curzon and people helping them to do so. I mean, there are many of these things, they know all these things. And most recently when I was there, of course, the older people, they didn't make a fuss about it, but quietly they said, well, these young people, of course, they have their politics to make and so on. But we know that actually there was a lot of good. A lot of the British people out there knew languages, knew much more about the country, they were humane people, and above all, they were not putting money in their own pockets. And of course the feature now in Pakistan and India is that everyone is corrupt. They assume that nothing can be achieved unless you have a Safarish and so on. And the British in the last century or so were not corrupt. And so, I mean, I don't think the thing is as gloomy as you protest. Maybe the academic world is now taking a particular view, but there'll be.
Well, I am very concerned.
It'll get
if you go to Shashi's, any of his, I would call them revival meetings, there's this enormous, I mean, he's a pop star, you know, and the young people just adore him. And it's quite worrying because I see that as well, we can find parallels in this country, but I'm not going to go there. Sorry, I shouldn't have been in politics. Can I just say a word incidentally? I know we've got a couple of friends. Could you be very careful as to when you quote anything by me? Sorry, I'm just thinking I don't want to upset anybody in India. I think it is being published later on, this particular thing, but so I'd be enormously grateful if you wouldn't quote me tonight. Do you mind? I'm so sorry.
Absolutely.
I would like to be able to quote, what's that wonderful phrase when you go and speak at Chatham House rules? But we can't apply it here, this is not Chatham House. You can? Okay, retrospective Chatham House rules. No, I think it's a very fair point, and I think, I don't know, I do worry sometimes that when I think of the older generation, Either they were incredibly polite, or they were just being hypocritical in the nice things they've said to me about the past. On the other hand, I know the young people were impatient. I think, some of the horrible things that the Brits did do. You will know that, I think about 500 years ago, I did a book called Plain Tales from the Rod. And I remember interviewing a military guy who said that, I'm ashamed of the fact that on my first journey out, I kicked an Indian out of my railway carriage. And I thought how disgraceful that is that you can. And I think another one went on to say, he kicked an Indian out of the railway carriage. And when they came to the next station, he came to an Indian native state, and there was an entire lunch prepared for him. And he stepped out and said, "Why did you come this way?" And then he was sitting down, and he was served by the man he kicked out of the train. It was a local Maharaja. And I thought, well, that's pretty generous of you. I think it's in there somewhere, you'll find it. Yes, thank you so much.
I'm also a student of history. So I had done my post-graduation in history, and British history is also a special paper for me. So I also know British history as well as Indian history. But my question is not regarding Indian or British history, but specifically on this Shashi Tharoor issue.
Yes.
You told about that Shashi has made a state whatever he said, his content is not perfect. But
No, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right.
But I would like to say that 200 years, for any rule of 200 years is too long a period. If you can see, since 1947, 70 odd years, from where what India in 1947 and what India in 2018 is a sea change. So don't you think 200 years, when you are governing a nation, you are a ruler, you have the responsibility.
We had it, and we didn't do as well as we could.
By that logic, how you can discount the logic of Shashi Tharoor?
I always think there's a divergence, and I'm going to come back to what I'm not blowing comparison. I'm so sorry. Nicholas, what's that Nicholas has said? Did we miss an opportunity here? I think of people like Lord Mountstuart Elphinstone, 1810. The greatest death that we can die of would be to bring India to such a state of self-confidence, was afraid that we could govern themselves. And why on earth did it take so long? And I think of the good people in India having to deal with people like Churchill and Parliament. I mean, it's Parliament that are bringing in all these restrictions on trade, the tariff barriers and so on. It's not the people in India.
It took a long time for us to get women to vote in our country, not just India. It's still happening all around the world.
I know. I mean, we are seeing an international phenomenon, the idea of simplifying history. But my point really is I worry for the young people of India. I think that's fair enough. I'm not sure in this country, do I want to worry for the young people?
And to add to this, that Shashi Tharoor is not a fundamentalist right-wing politician. He is a very much secular and modern politician who is always on the target of the right-wing politicians.
You're right. This is the irony. It's not Shashi who actually says, that the Aryans are actually descendants of the Harappans. It's the Hindutva. It's the Hindutras who say, we are actually the people we're the people who colonized Europe. That is part of the Hindutva philosophy. I mean, all these bizarre theories that are coming out of the ground now. And I just... Are you going to defend your answer?
Last question. It's a comment. The popularity of Shashi Tharoor, I think, arises from the comment that this gentleman made, that since from 47 to 2018, from 1947 to 2018, India has made tremendous capitalist progress. And that wasn't so in the 100 years or 200 years before that. And there are very many factors for that. One, certainly, that the young people who follow Shashi Tharoor, make him a pop star, look upon the British as not encouraging the industrialization of India. And it didn't happen
It happened with the Parsis, as you mentioned, to a small extent. When the Brits left, India had made 1 million tons of steel in the Tata factory in Jamshedpur. Today they make 75 million tons, or 175, I don't know. Last time I read it was 75. And that was the lumpiness of capital accounted for the non-development of Indians, because capital came to the East India Company, for instance, through the idea that people could put money into an enterprise. In India, only Gujarati families stuck to themselves, clans, castes, Parsi families would only finance their own opium enterprise. And so they grew without the lumpiness of capital. And you need capital to
Well,
make
indeed,
enterprise.
and the people who did have capital, of course, thought it was beneath their dignity. I think particularly of the Mughal families and indeed the lieutenants. They had the capital, but they didn't want to dirty their fingers because they were warriors. And I think this is part of the caste system I was talking about. But we have two very distinguished historians here, incidentally. I'm so sorry, my brain's going completely blank. Both of them. No. Your book is called India, and Ronnie's book is called.
Oh, there's several. Jinnah versus Gandhi is the.
No, the last one.
The last one is called The Great Indian Rupture.
Well, anyway, you want to see the other side
There's
of
not
the
like
story.
Rajwalla's coming out soon.
The other side of the story. Here we are.
We've
As I
kept
say,
very
and
quiet.
of course, Farouk is from a
Thank
very
you, sir.
distinguished Parsi family, and of course, he's a Marxist. Don't touch him.